All right, so consequentialism, we'll get into the details of it, but essentially it's the idea that what matters most morally are the consequences of our actions and our policies. That's how we're going to determine whether our action was the right action, was based on the consequences that are produced by that action or by that policy. Last time that I presented, we talked about how to prep a case. So the first things you do is you try to understand what type of case is this. Is this a very personal case, or is this a big public policy case, or is it somewhere in between? Then you try to empathetically enter into the positions of the stakeholders or the people that are impacted by whatever decision is that we're going to make in the ethics bowl case. So if we recommend a policy or a course of action, who all is going to be impacted? What are their interests, their desires, and are those interests and desires morally legitimate or not? And of those that are morally legitimate, how should we rank them? Which ones should we take seriously? Which ones do we not need to take as seriously? Once we've done that first step in the process of empathizing, then it's time to start turning some of our empathy and maybe some of our intuitions into principled arguments. One of the things that distinguishes Ethics Bowl from other types of competitions is that your arguments need to be grounded in moral principles or moral intuitions that you would be willing to apply to other cases aside from just this one. So what we do in the preparation process is we try to identify some of the strongest arguments that maybe come from different starting points. And oftentimes disagreements can be traced back to fundamental disagreements about starting points or moral principles or moral intuitions. And oftentimes we can even trace those back further to convictions about human nature or the nature of reality, like metaphysical sort of questions. So we try to understand not only the stakeholders in the case, but then also try to understand the various viewpoints that people are going to bring to the table when they have an ethical conversation. And so we're going to systematically work through some of the most popular historical arguments or historical moral principles and types of arguments that are drawn from them in order to lay out the possible options, some of the best options available. And then after we do that, after we've seen how different people might think through the case, then we try to pick the strongest argument and incorporate some of the objections that we have gleaned from thinking about other viewpoints into our opening presentation so that we make sure to talk about alternative perspectives in our opening presentation. That's in the rubric for Ethics Bowl, that you have to show that you understand the weaknesses of your own position and that you understand how other people that are coming from different starting points, different points of view, might view the case differently than you do. All right, so we're going to focus now in this lecture on the moral principles side of things, and we're going to focus specifically on one of the most popular approaches to ethics, which is a consequentialist approach. And there are a lot of consequentialist approaches. We're going to specifically focus on the most popular, at least historically popular, version of consequentialism called utilitarianism. In an ethics bowl context, just so you know, you are encouraged actually not to drop isms, right? Ethical theory names or technical jargon as you engage in the conversation. But it is helpful to know these theories so that you can identify the moral principles and intuitions that other teams are bringing to the table, and so that you can critically evaluate the principles that you might be putting forth as well. Because there are some common objections and common defenses for each of these major moral principles and ethical theories that we're going to discuss. And it's really helpful to learn from the history of dialogue about whether those are viable principles and viable types of arguments or not. So I think it's important for us to learn about these theories, but you don't necessarily need to go in and say, we are taking a consequentialist approach to this case, and then use all kinds of technical jargon to explain your view. Instead, you should use normal, common language like you would have in conversation with somebody, with a friend, or with somebody that you're having a kind of debate or conversation with, not assuming that they've had ethical theory training. All right. So when we make moral arguments, after we've done that empathy process, you're going to try to connect up different, what we call propositions. Those are truth claims. They're claims that fall in, they're kind of a judgment about reality. And those judgments could be either true or false. And when we connect up propositions in logical ways, we can develop arguments that entail a conclusion. So in deductive arguments, you're generally going to start with some universal claim, and then, and that's in an ethics bowl case, that's going to be some universal moral principle, right? Something that you think applies across the board, some intuition or principle that you think holds for moral questions. And then you're going to connect that universal claim to something particular or specific about the case at hand. From that, you're going to draw a conclusion about the case at hand, and that's typically how we operate. Sometimes, however, you're going to make inductive arguments where you're going to come up with examples that point in a direction. And so you want to try to come up with cogent and strong inductive arguments. But usually we're going to try to find deductively valid arguments that have all true premises. And so that would make it a sound argument. And those are the types of arguments we should strive for. So moral arguments, as I said, specifically start with major moral principles or a major premise that is grounded in some major moral principle or intuition. And then a minor premise where you bring in the relevant evidence and reasons from the case. Now, you could have many, many, many minor premises and have really long, complicated arguments. Usually, you can boil the core of your argument down to just a few premises, a few propositions, and a simple conclusion that clearly and directly answers the question that was asked of you. So you want to make sure that your argument flows logically and that the premises that you're putting forth have good reasons behind them that would lead someone to believe that it's at least highly likely that those premises are true. That's what makes for a really sound argument in an ethics bowl case. So when we look at those major premises, it's helpful to have this historical context, to have some sense of what the main positions are in professional ethics, and also kind of operative in our societies. And so there are a lot of possible moral intuitions or principles that you could ground arguments in, and you might hear some of these as you engage in ethical discussions. Some people are going to say that it is our duty to promote happiness, and then you're going to have to ask them, what do you mean by happiness, right? And people disagree about what happiness is, right? So how you define happiness. Some people are going to put a lot of emphasis on respecting other people's rights. Some people are going to say the key is to be reasonable or rational. Others are going to say freedom's the most important thing. We need to maximize freedom. Other people say you don't necessarily have to promote flourishing, but you have to reduce suffering. Other people say, follow your heart, right? Some people say, just do what your community says to do. Follow the rules of your community or of your people. Some people say, act naturally or act in accordance with nature, in accordance with human nature in some cases. And those could be very different things. Some people ground morality in religious convictions, like God is the highest standard of morality, and therefore you need to obey God in order to be right and to be good. Others say actualize your potential, and then they might define your potential in a variety of ways. Some say simply just do no harm, or get consent, or do your duty. So there's all kinds of principles and intuitions that are out there, and if you enter into any kind of ethical discussion, you're probably going to hear people referencing these types of terms and many more. So I'm just putting them up on the screen so you can kind of think about the various ways in which people approach ethics cases. And you'll see that depending on the approach you take, whatever your major moral principle is, you might end up at different conclusions. Or in some cases, you might have different starting points that arrive at the same conclusion. That doesn't mean you fully agreed, right? Even though you agreed on your conclusion, doesn't mean that you agreed on the reasons for why your conclusion is the one that should be taken. All right, so the major moral theories that you will probably hear referenced in an ethics bowl case fall into 4 or 5 different buckets. The very popular one that we're going to talk about today is consequentialism, which says that it's consequences that determine the rightness or wrongness of an action. Sometimes you'll find that people will look to consequences for every single action and evaluate each action by itself as an independent instance that needs to be determined for its rightness or wrongness based on the consequences that that specific action produces. And then others are going to take an approach that says, well, there have to be rules and we need to evaluate what the good rules are and what the bad rules are on the basis of the consequences that they generally produce. So that's kind of a bit of a hybrid position, but we'll talk about it. Then there's a different approach that says the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by its being in accordance with duty, and it's typically the intention to do your duty that is the mark of the rightness or the wrongness of the action. So in some cases, you'll see that it's the intention. Sometimes it's just action types that are ruled out. Certain action types are ruled out. The most famous versions of these are going to be Kantian deontology, where he's going to say that Immanuel Kant, very famous German philosopher, that says you need to take whatever particular policy you've developed for yourself and try to turn it into a law by universalizing it and imagining a world in which everybody followed that same policy. Don't make an exception of yourself, but see what it would be like. Could you even think a world? Could you imagine a world consistently where everybody did this thing that you're proposing to do? And even if you could imagine that world, would you want to live in that world? So we'll talk about that in a later lecture. But that often gets hashed out in terms of making sure that you treat other people as ends in themselves, often determined by a lot of contemporary theorists by whether you get their consent, implicit or explicit consent, to do the thing you want to do to them. And that can often also get hashed out in terms of rights, right? So what rights do people have? What kinds of protections against other people harming them? And we have to respect those rights. So that's a deontological approach as well. And then there's a divine command theory, which historically is a very popular viewpoint, not as popular in contemporary society, but the idea being that God's commands, or some greatest deity, the commands of that being are the things that define what is right and wrong, and you need to obey obey those divine commands. Okay, then there are other philosophers, and this is kind of a resurgence that is a very classical sort of approach to ethics that has been resurgent in the past, since basically, well, some would say the middle of the last century, some would say towards the end of the last century. And the idea being that right and wrong are first of all fairly unhelpful terms. There's much more rich language that we can use to describe people and their actions, and those words are typically virtue and vice words. So wisdom, justice, temperance, courage, lovingness, right? Those are, in order to understand what the right thing to do is, you want to look at the moral exemplars, the people that have a lot of virtue, that have cultivated over a long time the steady disposition to think and act and feel in the right ways, and see what they would do in similar circumstances and kind of follow their advice. And oftentimes it's going to be somewhat context or situation specific, and a wise or prudent person who's developed that ability to do the right thing for the right reasons and in the right way will be able to navigate the nuances of difficult moral dilemmas really well, but they're not necessarily going to do it in accordance with some hard and fast rule. They might have principles that they apply. They might have some rules of thumb, but they aren't going to be kind of fixated on the rules. They're going to take a lot of things into account when they make their decisions. There are also people who think that morality really isn't about facts. It's more about feelings or about opinions. And they might think that individuals have their own moral systems, and they might even say you should follow your own moral system. So emotivism, relativism, egoism, they're all kind of in this ballpark, and sometimes they take the form of individual sort of relativism. Sometimes they take the form of cultural relativism, where you should do what your culture says, but no culture can really tell another culture that they're wrong. And so cultural relativism and individual relativism are positions that they're not often employed in ethics bowl context, but they are quite popular in contemporary society. And then oftentimes, especially when it comes to public policy sorts of questions, you'll hear social contract theories of a variety of sorts referenced. And there are some questions as to whether that's its own kind of theory, or is it ethics by agreement? Does that kind of slide into relativism? Or oftentimes social contract theories have rights built into them. So is it a kind of a deontology? And there's a lot of questions about what exactly social contract theory is and where it fits within this framework. But you'll hear it referenced a lot in ethics bowl cases, and it'd be good to understand what the claims are there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about specifically utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a very famous form of consequentialism that was put forth by Jeremy Bentham and then later John Stuart Mill. So Bentham and Mill, this is coming from Bentham. He said, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. That is the throne of pain and pleasure, right? They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality, he will remain subject to it all the while. The principle of utility, from which we get the name utilitarianism, recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. Systems which attempt to question it deal in sounds instead of sense, in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light. Okay, so this is Bentham's view that we can ground all of our moral system in pain and pleasure ultimately. Okay, so how does that work? He says that the right action is the one that maximizes happiness for the greatest number of people. So bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And you notice that it's about the consequences. Did you actually bring about happiness? So an action's moral worth is determined by its consequences, not by categorical truths of reason or natural laws or divine commands, but by the consequences that are brought about by that action. Secondly, he defines happiness as the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. So that's a kind of hedonistic approach to ethics. So the consequences that matter morally, according to Bentham, are pain and pleasure. Happiness is just the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. And then you have to kind of bring together all of the pleasures and pains that are produced by your action, all the people that are impacted by your action, sum up as all of those pains and pleasures, and figure out which possible course of action is going to maximize then the amount of pleasure and minimize the amount of pain. So I actually thought that you could kind of create a pros and cons chart and list all the pleasures that are produced by an action and all the pains that are produced by an action. And if you think about all the possible actions you could take, you can come up with a calculation that would tell you by a form of mathematics what it is that you should do. Which of these gets the highest score? That's the course of action I should take. And if you think about it, what's interesting about this is that it is grounding ethics in something that's not based in intuition, not based in some amorphous feeling, but is actually something that in principle we could measure scientifically, right? We could theoretically hook everybody up to some measuring instruments that would be able to track their brain activity and find out how much pleasure stimulation is happening and how much pain stimulation is happening. And we could put all that data into a machine that could actually calculate which is the best action. And so he would make these kinds of charts. And there's a very famous case. It's called the lifeboat case. Maybe some of you have seen. Michael Sandel is quite famous for his use of this case in his Harvard course, his Harvard Justice course. So there was a case where you had three people on a boat that ended up out to sea. They got swept away, and nobody knew where they were, and they couldn't get back on course. The winds died down, and they're just stuck, right? They end up eating up all of their food, and you've got I think there were four people on it. One of whom, so the other three were like the captain and some people that had some position of authority. They had connections back home. They have some value to society. And then the fourth person was this kind of person that they hired off the street to help them out, who doesn't have any connections back home. He's getting super sick because he drank some seawater. His life income, if you think in terms of how much pleasure could be produced by it, is of lower value than the other three men in the boat. So they see that he's getting sick. They hatch a plan as they're starting to starve to death to kill and then cannibalize him and actually eat him. And they ended up doing this. So they actually followed through on this plan. They murdered him and then ate him, and as a result, they ended up surviving and making their way back to England, and they ended up standing trial. Right, so it was found out that they had done this, and the question on the table was, did they do anything wrong here? According to a deontological approach, you just don't murder innocent people, especially given the power dynamic there. It's like really, really bad to take advantage of someone, use them as a means to your own survival. But a consequentialist would look at this and say, okay, you got 3 lives versus 1. The 3 lives that are saved are very valuable. The 1 life that was lost was not very valuable. So yeah, is there pain there? Yes, but it's not a ton in comparison to the pleasure that would be produced by saving the 3 lives. And dying slowly of starvation is a horrible way to die. So actually, maybe ending the cabin boy's life early might be sparing him of future pain, right? They've got friends and family back home that are going to be very happy to see them. The cabin boy doesn't have any connections back home. Now, maybe you might be concerned that if people hear about this story, then they might start taking murder less seriously. And we have to add all of those things into the calculus for sure. But a lot of people are going to argue that from a consequentialist perspective, it seems like they did the right thing and shouldn't be held accountable for their actions. All you have to do is sum up the pleasures and sum up the pains and figure out, of the possible courses of action that are available to them, is this the best one? And maybe, according to consequentialism, this was the way to go. Other people find this to be absolutely horrific. But if you've ever looked at trolley problem questions, there's a lot of confused moral intuitions when it comes to, should you kill one person in order to save 5? Should you kill one person to save 100 or 1,000? We start to add up the numbers on the one side of the equation, and your intuitions can get kind of scrambled there, where you might originally think that you should never kill an innocent person, but maybe as you start to think about all of the good that could be done by killing the one, if you start thinking in a consequentialist way, you might start to say, well, maybe it is okay. Maybe that is the best way to go. And there are lots of people that do hold that position. So, like I said, Mill and Bentham very interested in doing a scientific approach where we can measure something in the external world that will help us determine how to act. So Mill is especially really worried about intuitionism. So he says the chief danger represented by the proponents of intuitionism was not from the ethical content of the theories per se, which defended honesty, justice, benevolence, etc., but from the kinds of justification offered for their precepts and the support such a view lent to the social and political status quo. Mill takes intuitionism to be dangerous because it allegedly enables people to ratify their own prejudices as moral principles. In intuitionism, there is no external standard by which to adjudicate differing moral claims. For example, Mill understood Kant's categorical imperative as getting any moral force it possesses either from considerations of utility or the consequences that are produced from it, or from a mere prejudice hidden by hand-waving. So, the idea that we could just sum up pleasures and pains, right, is driving a lot of their view here. So the principle of utility alternatively evaluates moral claims by appealing to the external standard of pain and pleasure. It presented each individual for moral consideration as someone capable of suffering and enjoyment. So I got that from Colin Haight in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. All right. So this is the principle then that a utilitarian, especially a John Stuart Mill type utilitarian, would ground any ethical question. So the creed, which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or what is often referred to as the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. So if you're taking a consequentialist approach, you need to pay attention to who is being harmed or put into pain and suffering, and who is being benefited or experiencing pleasure. You got to try to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So when you construct this argument, the major moral principle is going to be an action is right if it maximizes happiness for the greatest number, or something like that. And by happiness, we have to define our terms. By happiness, we mean pleasure and the absence of pain, or you might say benefits and the reduction of harm. There's a lot of different ways you could do this. You could talk about suffering. You could talk about flourishing, potentially. And then what you would say is, of the available options, our team believes that action A, whatever your proposal is, produces the most happiness for the greatest number. And then you might do some comparison where you say, option A, we think it produces these results. Option B produces these results. Option C produces these results. And on balance, option A seems to us to be the best one. And so therefore, it's the right one because it brings about the most good stuff, the most benefits, and the reduction of harm and suffering. All right, so there are some distinctions that are important to make. Mill, for example, wanted to make a distinction that Bentham didn't make, at least not clearly, because Mill thought that we need to make a distinction between higher and lower pleasures, because you could imagine a situation in which everybody is served by being hooked up to drugs that make them experience pleasure all the time and minimize all their pain. There's plenty of dystopian novels that I'm sure some of you have read that paint that kind of a picture where we could just make everybody happy by just giving them drugs. And Mill's not convinced that that's actually the type of pleasures that we should be promoting. He thinks there are higher pleasures and lower pleasures. Higher pleasures being the ones that exercise our rational faculties and our creative faculties, as opposed to just our base physical pleasures. So he introduces that distinction. Whether he can do so legitimately or not, I'm not going to get into here, but it is one to know that he's going to argue that we should try to pursue higher pleasures over lower pleasures as we make our policies. All right, so this is a major moral theory, utilitarianism. What are some of the objections that you can raise against it as you're doing your own preparations, as you hear other teams use consequentialism or utilitarianism in particular? What are some things you need to consider if you want to adopt a utilitarian perspective? Let's go through some of those real quickly, and let's see what we think. So one is a kind of objection we call the calculation objection. So in order to know what the best course of action is, you need to know essentially perfect knowledge. You might need to have perfect knowledge of the future consequences of your action in order to know whether that action is the right action or the wrong action. And this seems completely unreasonable to those who object to utilitarianism. Oftentimes, we have very limited knowledge to go on. We don't know the outcomes, and especially if you think about the ripple effects of our actions. Like maybe we can imagine with some degree of certainty what the near-term consequences of our actions are going to be, but it's really hard to project way into the future or to imagine the other people that we don't even know that might be impacted downstream from our actions. And it seems like to really take the utilitarian perspective seriously, we have to know what all those consequences are going to be, because maybe in the near term you've got some good consequences, but way down the line we have really horrible outcomes. Isn't that, for example, how we have gotten ourselves into some of our environmental problems, where we try to pursue some near-term or even what seem like long-term objections of increasing wealth and producing products that are useful to people, and yet in the long term we end up polluting the environment in ways that impact everybody. So you have to think about like what all needs to go into that calculation, and do we actually have access to all the information that we need? If not, it becomes a fairly unworkable theory, because it doesn't give us any guidance on which action is right or wrong when we're making decisions. So it's not particularly helpful for making decisions if we can't calculate all the consequences. So that's one objection. Another one that is very important, is the justice objection or a rights-based objection. So for utilitarianism, there's no action type that is completely off limits. Any action type could end up being justified if you stack up enough pleasure on the other side of the equation. So if it were the case that by engaging in some sort of horrible torturing of the innocent or murdering of people or groups of people, that could somehow produce a whole bunch of pleasure, it seems like the consequentialist is going to have to say that that action is not only morally permissible, but actually might even be the best action, might be the action that is required of us if we want to do the right action. And that just seems really wrong, right? Like we have some deep intuitions about at least certain action types that nothing could possibly justify them. One thought experiment to think through as you test your intuitions on this would be, imagine that there was a car accident and there were 5 people in the car, and we take them to the emergency room and they all have life-threatening issues with them as a result of the car accident. And all of them need emergency transplants of certain vital organs, right? So one person needs a new heart, one person needs a liver, and so on and so forth. And let's just say that some random person in the waiting room who's there to visit his grandmother just happens to be a universal donor, perfectly healthy, perfectly innocent in this case, but is the perfect organ donor for those 5. Would it be okay to kill that innocent person and harvest their organs in order to save 5? Can you kill one to save 5? And it seems that most people's intuitions would suggest that no, you can't do that. But if that was the best available option in order to save 5 people's lives, all things being equal, assuming that each of their lives were equally valuable, it seems like 5 is better than 1. And so it seems like killing an innocent person could be morally justified on a consequentialist viewpoint. Of course, there are responses to all these objections, but I'm just going to put them out on the table for you to think about for our purposes right now. There's also a motivation objection. So it's not clear why it is that I should think about the greatest happiness for the greatest number as opposed to just my own happiness. We'd have to get into the details of Mill's arguments to see why this is a challenge. But he seems to make a leap from what we desire is happiness to what we desire is happiness for the greatest number. Because oftentimes it's going to require me to sacrifice my own happiness in order to bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And it's not clear how we can derive that motivation. You could also say that consequentialism is quite demanding. Not only is it so demanding in the sense that we have to calculate things that are really hard to calculate, but also every action needs to be maximally good, right? So we have to always be thinking about how to maximize happiness with every single act that we do. Me giving this lecture right now is probably not maximizing happiness. There are probably other things I could be doing. And on a consequentialist view, it could be argued that what I'm doing, therefore, is wrong. I should be doing something else with my time. And that's kind of connected as well to a special relations objection. So utilitarianism seems to require that I give equal regard to all people, even those that are spatially and temporally quite distant from me. So people way in the future, people way on the other side of the globe, I need to give them as much regard as I do to my own children. And a lot of people think that this is not only too demanding, but also kind of doesn't square with their intuitions. It seems like it should be okay for people to care about their own children, their own spouses, in a way that doesn't apply to children around the globe, right? So the special relations objection often comes into play. Also seems kind of weird, like if I were to think about how to treat my children, to always be using a calculation to decide that. It seems like a morally virtuous person doesn't really calculate in that sort of way. I'm going to skip over this last one because it's very specific to the text and we don't need to get into it. So what are some replies? How can we make this stronger? If those are some common objections to utilitarianism, how might someone like Mill or Bentham reply? Well, they might say that the large majority of actions intend the good of individuals, including ourselves, rather than the good of the world, yet the world's good is made up of the good of individuals that constitute it. And unless we are in a position of, say, a legislator, somebody that's in charge of making laws, we act properly by looking to the private rather than the public good. So this is actually a defense that Mill gives, right? Our attention to the public well-being usually needs to extend only so far as it requires to know that we're not violating the rights of others. So that might be a way to respond to the too demanding objection. For the justice objection, this is something, for Mill, to have a right is to have something which society ought to defend me in the possession of. If an objector goes on to ask why it ought, I can give no other reason than general utility. So Mill's going to say that any justice claim or rights claim that we make ultimately is going to have its ground in utility. And there, in moments like this, Mill sounds kind of like what we would call a rule utilitarian. Usually he sounds like an act utilitarian, but sometimes he sounds like a rule utilitarian, where we should follow the rules that, when followed, bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That would help us with the justice objection. Should you kill an innocent person and harvest the organs? No. Even though in this particular situation, that might maximize happiness, what you should do is follow the rules that, when generally followed, will bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And if everybody was going around calculating, should I kill this innocent person right now in order to maximize happiness, that would be a bad policy, bad law system for a society to follow. And so therefore, you should follow the rules that bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And that's definitely one way that gets cleaned up.